The original Road Rash game came basically out of nowhere for most of us, as marketing for video games was pretty minimal at the time. Road Rash started out as a simulation-style game that was meant to become one of the projects that would ascend from the ashes of the video game Crash in the mid-80s. During this time, a lot of game developers were staying in the home computer gaming space, as the console space was too risky. But once the Nintendo Entertainment System came out, everything started to improve. Eventually, who would later become the lead programmer of Road Rash was inspired by a long motorcycle drive in California and pitched his idea to EA, who gave it the green light after a series of alterations. Road Rash evolved from being a straightforward simulation game to a high-energy, more arcadey, somewhat violent racing game with beat-em-up elements mixed in that the likes of which had not been seen. Once the idea was fully formed, the more powerful Sega Genesis was on the horizon, and it made more sense to build Road Rash for that platform, which at the time was embracing more risky and wacky experiences than the family-friendly NES, and it was sure to fit in better with that slightly older, more mature audience. Not only that, but the Sega Genesis, compared to the NES, was more powerful, and it was going to be able to run the fast scaling and scrolling of sprites that Road Rash would require. Once the game finally saw the inside of retail stores, it almost immediately soared to the top of EA's sales charts, and it turned into a success in every conceivable way. An edgy presentation, tight gameplay that was programmed by experienced racing game developers, and perfect timing of the release, as the early 90s couldn't have been a better time for a game like this, all added up, and Road Rash became an icon among racing fans and action game fans alike. The success was only compounded by the sequel that came out a year later that looked even better and added a two-player mode, satisfying the only real complaints about the original while losing none of what worked. Toward the end of the Genesis, we saw Road Rash 3, which added some new bells and whistles, but was largely the same as 2, which wasn't a bad thing as it kept the franchise relevant, all while improved ports of the original game were being planned for future hardware like the 3DO, Sega Saturn, Sega CD, N64, and the PlayStation. These ports ended up having mixed results, but nevertheless, at this point the franchise was nothing short of popular in arcades and among a wide variety of gamers, and had achieved a legendary status that few franchises ever came close to. Sadly, these three original games were over 20 years ago, so why would these games that were so incredible in so many ways just die off like that? What the hell happened to Road Rash? Unfortunately, as I mentioned with those ports to the 32 and 64-bit systems of the mid and late 90s, the franchise saw a series of mixed results. The PlayStation port and the sequel, Road Rash Jailbreak, were okay, and even though betting on the future of polygonal-based games worked out for Sony in the long run, some games didn't handle it all that well. Sadly for us, the Road Rash games were part of that group. Texture popping was rampant, the controls were sluggish, and while younger gamers who had no point of reference probably didn't notice that too much, Road Rash veterans were largely disappointed with the PlayStation 1 version and preferred their Genesis versions more. Road Rash 64 didn't fare much better, as the cartoony graphics might have made it appear to fit in with the N64 library. The game itself didn't really resonate with that particular audience much, although it did receive fairly good reviews. The only undeniable success of Road Rash in the post-Genesis era at this point was the port to the 3DO, which was excellent as it mixed polygonal elements in the background with scaling sprites in just the right way and produced a modern feeling game but still ran super smoothly. The only problem here is that, well, nobody owned a 3DO, so the game would only really get played by people who didn't mind buying a $700 system and kids whose parents had more money than sense. So even though that version was truly excellent, it just didn't add up to much in EA's eyes. Sadly, the overall lackluster performance of the series after the 16-bit era led to a big cooling off of interest from fans and executives alike, and even though there was interest from Criterion Games in doing a Burnout Road Rash crossover game at some point, which probably would have been outstanding, any attempts to officially revive the franchise have been undercut by one factor or another. The lead programmer himself couldn't even get a relatively recent spiritual successor attempt off off the ground with what he called Hard Rider Back in the Saddle, which was apparently doomed from the start as it had virtually no financial backing and very little visibility. Some efforts to unofficially add to the Road Rash legacy have been made by others, and the spirit of that is always welcome in my book, but sadly these efforts have largely fallen short to capture what made Road Rash so much fun. More notable attempts include a game called Road Rage, which was relatively boring and felt incomplete as their attempt to bring to Road Rash what was brought to Burnout in the open-world Burnout Paradise game, was a meager, glitch-ridden attempt at best, and was simply insufficient in feeling like much of a game at all, let alone a spiritual successor to Road Rash, the game its title more than implied it was inspired by. Some other Kickstarters have come and gone and haven't really added up to much, but Road Redemption was made and surprisingly made some major progress in a lot of the areas where Road Rage failed, and might be worth your time if you're looking for a modern iteration of the originals, especially at its friendly indie price. The fact that this game turned out relatively well is a good sign for the franchise and could perhaps lure some talent and capital back in the direction of a proper revival. Although if you account for some of the choices EA has made in recent years, that could be wishful thinking on my part. Regardless of whether or not the future of Road Rash lies in AAA proper revivals or with independently developed spiritual successors, it's still disheartening to see so little progress being made in such a long time with such a great concept, especially since those of us who played the originals know how well a proper Road Rash 4 could do if developed and marketed properly. Hopefully, now that a lot of the kids and teenagers who loved Road Rash games growing up are now in their 30s and are starting to find themselves at the levers of power in the video game industry, we'll see some more big budget attempts at a proper revival, but only time will tell.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.